Well, folks, I am here with my friend Leveret Butts. He's an author of a collection of short fiction, Emily Stitches, The Confessions of Thomas Calloway and Other Stories, and the four-volume Western fantasy series, Guns of the Wasteland, retelling the King Arthur legends as an American Western, the volume of which, Dissonance, was released last month. His work has received several awards, including honorable mention in the 2019 Georgia Independent Authors Award for Historical Fiction for the third volume of Guns of Wasteland, Dispersal. Emily Stitches and the omnibus volume of Guns of the Wasteland Volumes 1 and 2 were both finalists for the Georgia Author of the Year Award. He teaches American literature for the University of North Georgia, and he resides in Carrollton, Georgia, with his wife and his son. So let's just start, Lev, with how are things in Carrollton as far as the restrictions that are imposed on you because of this pandemic?
Well, about a week before Governor Kemp instituted the lockdown last week, Carrollton had already done a shelter-in-place order, which meant that pretty much we all have to stay in our homes as much as possible. We're allowed to leave for essential needs such as medicines, groceries. We can leave to go exercise if we have to, as long as we maintain 6-foot social distance. But pretty much we're stuck at home. Fortunately, I can work from home. So,
and your work being a professor obviously is now digital. Is that something that is new for you? Is it something you have to learn because of the restrictions, or is it something that's old hat and not a big deal?
It's a little of both. I've taught some online classes for several years now. What's new for me is having convert classes that had been face-to-face to an online format. I'm finding several of my students that I have face-to-face are having trouble remembering to log in and do their discussions and things like that, but we're getting through it.
And what is it like doing tasks in town, like going to the bank and people now, the pressures of putting face masks? I've got a real doozy to show you. And you know, have you had to go to the bank looking like this? I mean, you're a Western guy. You look like a bank robber. I mean, how would that go over in your town?
Fortunately, I haven't had to find out. But because all of our banks are drive-through, and it's hard to hold up a bank through a car. But my son is a nurse, and one of my wife's friends made several of these masks for him, and so he wanted to make sure that his mother and I had one. So I use this.
Well, thank goodness. I mean, I think you're the first person I've interviewed who's got a son who is a nurse. How is he handling the stress, and is he on the front lines of battling this virus and all the people affected by it?
He's handling it pretty well. He's working 3 days this week, Wednesday, Thursday, and then tomorrow. He works 12-hour shifts at the emergency room in a local hospital in Villa Rica, so the next town over. They haven't had the numbers of cases that we've heard about even in Carrollton or Atlanta, but he is noticing an uptick in those cases. But they gave him an 85 mask, and he's maintaining more social distancing at the house. He doesn't come into the living room. We sit on the back porch 6 feet away and we talk.
Well, that makes life interesting. And when it comes time to feed the poor boy, do you guys like have a big table, or does he come in and self-serve, or what does he do?
We eat on the back porch, and he has his own little TV table, and we put his food there for him, and then we eat on the other side of the porch with him. And then we just kind of sit and visit for the evening until he has to go to bed.
And one other personal thing, I understand you guys are going through a move. I'm intrigued. How do you go through a move with the social distancing and all the face mask and the gloves and everything else?
Well, the nice thing about it is it's, even though we're leaving the house here and going to the old house, which is about 20 miles away, we're still not seeing anybody. You know, we stay in our houses together, and we get in our car together, we drive to the old house, and we work in the old house, and we don't see anybody. We get back in our house. If we do have to go get like garbage bags or supplies or something, we wear our little masks. But yeah, we're still able to go through the move. I actually asked one of our state representatives if that was okay, and he's like, yeah, because real estate business is considered essential business.
So let's now transfer to your own writing.
All right.
I know you've just finished a work, Dissonance, and I've got a couple of friends in Horror Writers Association who, are kind of burned by the lack of the ability to go to big events, Stoker Con and others. And so
right.
if a book comes out during this pandemic and you're not able to publicize it in person, how are you able to do that? And let's give you some time during this interview to publicize it and tell the listeners where the inspiration came from, a little bit about the series, and certainly hold up the book and show us the cover and give us the skinny on it.
So this is the first volume. I don't know if you can.
Yep, that's good. That's
Guns of Wasteland.
Yep.
This one came out about 2011, I think. This is the one that was just released, the fourth and final volume.
Yep.
Okay. They're all available on Amazon. This is the second volume and the third. They're all available on Amazon. And usually when I release one, I do several local conventions, AnachroCon. I was able to attend the Dahlonega Literary Festival here in Georgia in the mountains just before the lockdown hit. So then that was the debut of the fourth volume. But really all I can do right now is online promotion, because most of the cons have been canceled and things like that. The book itself came from an idea I had when I was working on my master's thesis. I was writing about the hero in American literature and how the shape of what we consider a hero has changed. And I came across an article that said the closest thing American letters had to the knight in shining armor was the cowboy.
Yeah.
And I've always been interested in King Arthur literature, novels, things like that, the legends. And I wondered if anyone had ever written a Western retelling of King Arthur. And nobody had. And so around 2010, it circled around my head for 10 years. And then in the early 2009, I just decided to write it. And it's taken me about 10 years, but I finally finished the whole series.
Well, that's quite an achievement. That's and I believe, don't you have a personal website as well where people can find out more information about them?
I do. It's leveretbutts.com.
Okay, so they can find this series here and synopsis of the book and then buy them on Amazon as well.
Yep.
So the other mystery that I want you to talk a little bit about, because so many of your friends and my friends have asked, and really this is the first time you and I are able to chat about it because we can't go to conventions, is the collaboration that you and I have done about my great-granduncle Bram Stoker. And we just found out, and we can let folks know that Weird Tales magazine has gone through a resurgence. It's had put out an edition, and another one is coming out this summer. I think it would be appropriate, Lev, if you tell the listeners a little bit about Last Days, much as you care to, and then I'll fill in whatever blanks we want to, and then we can tell about our next project that you brought to the table, which is the sort of the Sherlock merger, let's just say. So let's talk about Last Days first.
So Last Days is an idea that you approached me with about the Last Days refers to both the last days of Bram Stoker and his son Noel finds some papers in Bram's chest that kind of imply there may be some reality to the Dracula story. And then the second part of the story deals with some of those notes, which focus on how Renfield wound up in the mental institution at the beginning of the novel. That was a lot of fun to write. I described collaborating with you as it's kind of like you showed up with all of these ideas, these pieces to the jigsaw puzzle. And my job was to figure out how those pieces fit together into a coherent narrative, and which pieces I'd need to make because the puzzle was missing some, and which pieces didn't belong to this puzzle. And I'm very proud of the final product. I can't wait for people to read it in Weird Tales.
I'm glad you used that description of our collaboration. It's because it's an awful lot like J.D. Barker and I for Dracul, and it's not easy being an author, either providing all the pieces and having faith in somebody to put them together properly, or I'm sure from your end, what do you get when you're dealing with a guy that brings all these different pieces of the puzzle, and now you've got to put it together. But there was so much good back and forth. We spent an awful lot of time on the phone and in person. And I'm really looking forward to this finally coming out in Weird Tales. So I think it's going to be, it'll be fun, especially since it's our first work. But at the same time, since that's been on hold until Weird Tales comes out, you brought to the table something that I thought was very interesting. I'm not sure if listeners will kind of get the significance when you mentioned Sherlock Holmes anthology, but Bram Stoker and Arthur Conan Doyle were quite close as far as friendship goes, and professionally. Bram actually wrote an article about Conan Doyle just before he was married. It was a very lengthy article in British and American newspapers, but also Conan Doyle was one of those famous people that wrote a letter to Bram congratulating him on his success with Dracula. And I also believe that both of them shared a very interesting interest in spirituality. Conan Doyle's, I think, is a little bit more well known as far as how that dominated parts of his life. Bram Stoker, Mark Twain, and others very interested in spirituality, spiritualism. But nonetheless, let's talk a little bit about what we're doing in sort of removing the supernatural from parts of Dracula and inserting them in a world that you're very familiar with, which is the Sherlock Holmes story and Watson.
Yeah. So I was approached by David Markham, who edits a yearly anthology. I think it's yearly, it may be twice yearly, but a regular anthology of Sherlock Holmes pastiches, the MX anthology of Sherlock Holmes. I believe the proceeds all go to support the children's home that is now situated in Conan Doyle's old house. But he had asked if you and I would be interested in writing a Sherlock Holmes story, a Sherlock Holmes pastiche. And of course we were. And the criteria, though, were they had to be a traditional pastiche, i.e. it had to be written by Watson. It had to be no supernatural elements. And so our challenge was, how do we cross Dracula with Sherlock Holmes if we can't have supernatural elements? And the way we've worked around it is the supernatural elements are implied to anyone who's read Dracula. But if you've not read Dracula, it just reads like a regular Sherlock Holmes story. It's named after one of Watson's unpublished Holmes adventures that he mentions by name in other stories, called the Adventure of the Tired Captain. And in our story, the Tired Captain is the father of Quincy Morris. He's a retired captain of the Confederate States Army of the Civil War, the American Civil War, and he hires Holmes to help him find where the body of his son is buried. And so it's been a lot of fun trying to figure out how Holmes is going to solve this case. And so we've been interviewing, we've had Sherlock Holmes interview Jonathan Harker and Mina. He's interviewed Arthur Holmwood. And of course, you see this narrative taking shape. And if you've read Dracula, you realize that while it's logically consistent with the evidence Holmes is getting, if you've read Dracula, you know that it's because Holmes doesn't consider supernatural elements. And so if you've read Dracula, by the end, you realize this will be a case that Holmes gets wrong because of his myopic insistence on rational explanations. And if you've not read Dracula, it's a completely different story. It's another story where Holmes solves the case and moves on to his others.